Etsy sellers might have been fooled. And well, the sales numbers aren't what they used to be. And for new sellers coming in or sellers that have been selling now for maybe the last, I would say, 2 years, the numbers are probably not going to be as great as they were. And there was an article that came out that I wanted to go through and talk through with Chris Schaefer, because this is something that I think people don't realize that haven't been here selling on Etsy for more than 4 or 5 years. So, Chris, can you get on here with me and can we dig into this? And what we're talking about, guys, is the pandemic. Was the pandemic, was those numbers the numbers that Etsy and really any of the other platforms, is that what they can expect? Because a lot of times you look at business and you're like, oh, year over year growth, right? You're like, whoa, wait a minute here. It's not really like it was back in the day, right? And I say back in the day when, when the pandemic was here. But the problem is now people are coming in, or maybe an Etsy guru or a guru, whatever channel you're on, Amazon, eBay, it doesn't matter. Those numbers are going to be higher. And so the way that I'm seeing this now is, if you're not aware of that and you're seeing those numbers from other people, those are not the numbers that you're probably going to expect now. And there's actually been some talk even within the Etsy stock that, the numbers aren't holding the way that they were. So were those numbers inflated because of the pandemic? So Chris, that's what I kind of wanted to dig in here.
And I know we covered a story a few weeks ago. Was it the Fortune 500, Scott?
Yes.
That Etsy fell out of.
Yep.
Right. And we even said at the time, well, duh. Right. Like, if you're looking at the 2020 numbers as the, where everything should be all the time, you're going to have a struggle meeting and exceeding that. Why?
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe because people aren't completely trapped in their houses anymore. And one of the things that seems to be a surprise to people is that Etsy isn't doing quite as well. Well, guess what? Most e-commerce businesses aren't doing quite as well. It's not to say that they're not growing or that they're having the same struggles that Etsy has been having, but they're not seeing that same level of growth. And I think one of the biggest problems that Etsy itself has run into is they said, this is the growth that we can expect. This is the level of sales that we can expect. And didn't think about the long-term consequences of it, right? You can only sell masks for so long until people don't need masks anymore. And then that entire sector of your business goes away, right? It's one of the reasons we talk about focusing on the niche and not on the product side of things. Etsy's future projections were all built around keeping and sustaining that level of success, which was never a real level of success. And what we're seeing here is people questioning what that is and why that is. And they're saying during the COVID-19 pandemic, right, they stood out as a standout success story in the e-commerce sector. Why? Because they had a lot of room to grow. Amazon already had a lot of market share. Yes, they grew, but they didn't have as much room to grow in terms of customer acquisition and some of those kinds of things. And so the question that's being posed is, are there post-COVID realities that we need to talk about here? And is this the new normal? Were sellers and buyers on the platform tricked by the volume that was coming through? And I think the answer to some extent is yes. Will Etsy get back to those levels? As long as they don't screw it up for sellers, I think they will eventually get back to where they were, just in a more sustainable way, right? If you take a whole bunch of shots of espresso, it feels really good until you crash from the caffeine. That's essentially what we were talking about in terms of the COVID related numbers for Etsy. They looked like they were flying high until that caffeine crash came in about a year ago and they started to dip. Now we are starting to see them do a handful of things that I think are important for sellers, and we can talk about that here in a minute. But the real moral of the story is what happened with Etsy, what's going on. And they're saying, look, Etsy's struggling to sustain the momentum, that same level of growth. Well, we also shouldn't expect that same level of growth. I wouldn't want to see things move completely backwards, but we shouldn't expect to see 10%, 20%, 30% year over year growth on a marketplace like this at the marketplace level. Individual shops, absolutely. But we won't see that giant spike unless something crazy happens again and buyer behavior shifts for whatever reason. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, and that's really why I wanted to do this, right? It's like, if you are looking at numbers from the pandemic, we can't we can't look at those numbers as those are what we can expect. The other thing is there is, and it says it in this article, there is more, there's more competition. There's more sellers now, right? And really, you know, there's also more places for people to buy, right? And there was I think it was this article, there was a couple that we were reading through, but there was one of them that said, well, there's Amazon Handmade now, there's eBay, you know, there's all of these other ones that are now offering the handmade stuff, when before you always went to Etsy to get the handmade and the more customizable and personalized type items. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm seeing, and that's why I wanted to bring this up.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting, and people are blaming it on the last few months only, but what we're starting to see is that there is a shift in economics, right? And what Yahoo Finance is blaming this on is the difference in interest rates and people cutting back on spending. And that's why we saw kind of at the beginning of this year, Etsy come out with gift mode as a way to start to stand apart and really start to be its own standalone place, not just be another ran commerce website. And what they found themselves in from a positional standpoint is that people were only going there as a unique hand good. They were looking for the artists, but they weren't necessarily looking at Etsy as a place to come back to again and again. And that's something we've also seen some other e-commerce people like Temu and Shein struggle with, where they could acquire a customer once, but they weren't able to keep them. What Etsy is trying to do with gift mode is get out of that, right? They want to get out of that discretionary, fully discretionary spending category and back into the Etsy is the place to go for gifts. And if they can make that transition, then they will start to see that consistency in sales that they wouldn't otherwise see. Gift mode to me is a way for them to protect themselves against some of the economic downturn. Even if you're not going to spend $100 on your parents, you know, your mom for Christmas this year, maybe you're still going to spend 80. You're still going to get your mom something for Christmas, even if you have fewer resources to do so. And if they can become that go-to place for gifting, which is really where they've doubled, tripled, and quadrupled down this year. If you've watched any of their quarterly calls, I know how much you love watching the stock stuff. I like watching it just to watch my doppelganger sweat as he's asked questions about the algorithm. But that's really where they're doubling down, because they don't want to be a place that's only discretionary spending, right? When you have some extra cash or you're stuck in your house and you want something cool, you go to Etsy. That's the image they want to get away from. The image they want to move into is the go-to place for gifts, so that you're not just thinking about them once a year. You're thinking about them 20 times throughout the year, 10 times throughout the years. You're thinking about all the birthdays and celebrations and Christmas and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to kind of bring this up, and, you know, really address it, because some people would say, well, you know, those are the numbers that I should be expecting. And, you know, I mean, look at the housing market, right? It's not what it was, right? Your interest rates aren't what they were, right? So that kind of slowed things down. Now, are the houses more expensive than they ever have been? Of course, because it went with that inflation, and then now it kind of leveled out. But you know, I just, again, some Etsy sellers are going to be disappointed if they're looking at those numbers or thinking to themselves like, oh, I have that opportunity. It's like we've talked about before too, people just chasing trends or throwing spaghetti at the wall, you know, and just throwing a whole bunch of different things in there. Not probably going to work for you anymore, right? Because it's not as big of a demand to go on there and just buy random stuff during a pandemic, right? And like you said, Chris, there's sellers that have made, you know, millions on masks. Don't need masks anymore. So, you know, there you go. Those numbers, I mean, even if you looked at like overall Etsy numbers, those masks are part of that. So those masks are, so what's taking the masks' place now, right? Are there other trends? Yes, but not as much as a mask.
But is there something taking the place of that is the question. And that, I think, is what Yahoo's really getting into with this article, right? They're talking about Etsy's sales growth versus the market as a whole. E-commerce sales, Scott, are up 9% essentially annually since 2022. Etsy is up, but they're only up 4%. Okay, but if we go back and we look at 2020 and we look at the growth curve there, it's kind of unrealistic, right? It's that taking a bunch of shots of espresso and not thinking that you're ever going to have a crash from it because you feel really darn hyped up right now doesn't mean that that's going to happen. And we're still seeing a little bit of a dip, but it's not necessarily something that we need to be concerned about long term if Etsy can make that shift. And that's the thing I think that people really need to understand. That's the reason Etsy's going so hard on this. The other thing Etsy's going really hard on right now is trying to figure out how to get away from the I think this is what I want search engine to the suggestion or recommendation search engine that you and I have talked about. I think this is a key for them long term. Biggest problem that Etsy has is that they have a search engine that's not great. And let's be honest, even Amazon's search engine for e-commerce, not so hot, but you can usually at least get an idea of what you're looking for. But by
Yeah.
the time you're going to Amazon, you pretty much know what you want. You're going to type in ceramic heater, right? And then you're going to get that.
You're going to get
When
it,
people
yeah.
are coming to Etsy because it is bespoke and unique products, they don't necessarily know exactly what to type in. That's
Right.
why Etsy launched gift mode. That's why they're looking at the suggestions or recommendations. Hey, if you bought this, this could be a really cool thing. That's a much better way to utilize Etsy catalog. And if they can make that shift, then you are going to start to see a reversal there because it's something people can actually use. The problem they ran into is, yes, maybe they came to get a cool mask, or maybe they came to get something when they were, I don't know, at home working and didn't have anybody looking over their shoulder and had time to browse around on Etsy all day,
Yeah.
versus being in the office. But the thing people need to understand there is it's not necessarily a bad thing that their growth has slowed if they can make that transition.
Yeah. So I guess the big question that I would ask, you guys is, do you still feel as though Etsy's a good opportunity for you? Me personally, I think it's still a great opportunity. Is it going to be as easy? Probably not. But it's still a great platform for someone that wants to get started, whether you are doing handmade or whether you're doing print on demand, which I'm a fan of. So is it still a great opportunity? I do believe it is. But I wanted to bring it to the attention of new sellers or sellers that have been on for 18 months and they're thinking to themselves, like, why am I not getting the sales that I thought I was going to be getting because I saw this over here? And that's just because you saw or you heard that the numbers were higher, or that you should be having a better fourth quarter. This fourth quarter a little bit different, right? We had an election, so that could have had something to do with it. There's a lot of variables that could have something to do with lower numbers if you are experiencing that. But the bottom line is, regardless, there's people still buying stuff online. That's the thing we know. So this is why we always talk about making sure that you're choosing a niche and you're building a brand, multiple products that can be served to the same customer, building a customer base. All of this stuff too, we cover in our 100K blueprint. We have a little blueprint that we put together that we have followed, not just in our Etsy business, but in other e-commerce businesses. We just basically took that, adapted it to the Etsy, channel. If you'd like a copy of that, just put 100K in the comments and we'll send it to you. Just put 100K in the comments and we'll send you a free copy of that. But that's what I would leave you with, is just understand that, yes, the numbers might not be what they were then, but it's still a really good opportunity.